don't believe when they all expect you to believe. If that's the kind of background you come from, you know it's not going to be easy.
Hello everyone. Welcome to the Secular Society of MIT's 5th Out and Out episode. We're very privileged today to have with us Dan Everett, who is an ex-missionary, and I'm really looking forward to this event, and hope you are too. So we're just, we're here for all secular students at MIT and people who are looking into secularism, who are looking into non-belief. We support them through thought and action, including events such as this one. We're affiliated with the SSA and CFI. This is our 5th Out and Out event. This is a sample of some of the events we have had in the past. We have had one for ex-Christians, ex-Jews. We have a couple for ex-Muslims, one for ex-Hindus, people thinking about religion, leaving religion, and so on. So supporting ex-believers is very important, as well as the focus of Out and Out is also ex-believers from specific religious communities, because they all have different experiences. While all ex-believers have some commonalities, there's also differences coming out of different religious communities. So that's what we aim to examine here at Out and Out and support. So yeah, that's the kind of community we're aiming to form. And so without further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Everett. So Dr. Daniel Everett is the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Bentley University in Waltham, Massachusetts. Prior to Bentley, he served as chairman of the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures at Illinois State University, where he was also the first and only holder of the university professor title. He received his SED from the Universidad Estadual de Campinas, Brazil, in 1983, where he also taught. He has authored 6 books and over 100 scientific articles on a variety of subjects in linguistics. But he is best known for his study of the Amazon basin's Pirahat people and their language, about which he wrote his master's and doctoral dissertations, and for which he gained some measure of fame and some measure of notoriety. Today, though, he will speak about the fascinating story in the backdrop of all this, a story of conversion, doubt, deconversion, and coming out. Please welcome Dr. Daniel Everett.
Where I'm going to be in a few months.
Where is that?
Anywhere out in the country. So, yeah, I've actually published 14 books now, I first came to MIT in 1984 when I was a visiting scholar in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy after I finished my PhD. And my first PhD student is a professor in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences here at MIT, Ted Gibson, and he used to be in linguistics as well. My research is in cognitive sciences and anthropology, linguistics, and a number of other areas. My son, who was raised in the Amazon, is chairman of the Department of Anthropology at the University of Miami in Florida, also a professor in the Department of Psychology there, and he is an atheist like I am. His 2 sisters, my daughters, who are all very close, are still Christian missionaries, and their husbands are missionary pilots. And my ex-wife, Karen, lives by herself in the middle of the jungle, still working very hard to convert the people that we worked with for many years. I'm really excited to be here. I think groups like this are very important. It's extremely important to have support groups for people who are thinking of leaving religion. You know, I do miss sometimes Christian services, not for the messages necessarily, but for the fact that you can enter a group, a social group, and have so much in common before you say a word. You know that you share a lot of values, and you can have really interesting conversations. So it's great that this is possible, and hopefully become more possible for atheists. I probably am going to. My intention is to start going to a Chabad synagogue in Amherst. I live closer to Amherst than I live here, because they don't seem to believe really anything, and they have really great times together, and they talk about interesting stuff at a fairly deep level. So it sounds, you know, just like the right kind of thing. When we were in, when I lived in Cambridge, which was 84, 85, as a visitor here at MIT, we went to Park Street Congregational Church in Boston, and my oldest daughter I baptized at Temple Tabernacle, you know, which is this, a Pentecostal church downtown Boston. And so when I was raised as an atheist. Well, I was raised not really thinking about any of that stuff. I grew up in Southern California in the 60s, so I just took drugs and had fun and played guitar. And, you know, my goal was to be a rock musician, and my greatest claim to fame probably when I was 17 playing warm-up for the blues musician Lightning Hopkins in a bar in San Diego. And but then I met a couple of kids in high school my age who were the children of missionaries. They had been raised in the Amazon jungle, and that sounded really cool because as a child of California in the 60s, the last thing I wanted to do was buy a tract home in the suburbs with a mailbox like everybody else and just live a common life. So I wanted to do something different. And being a rock musician or being a bum on Skid Row, something like that was quite different. And so they talked about being missionaries in the Amazon, and that not only sounded different, but it sounded really good the way they described it. Giving your life to help somebody else. Giving your life to make a difference in the lives of others. Living your life on purpose in obscurity in the middle of the jungle. Taking anything that nature could throw your way so that you could help others. And I met a lot of people in the Christian church who were you know, very friendly and respectful to me. The first time I went to church, I was on LSD, and the pastor came up to me wearing a gold sequin Nehru jacket and said, "So why don't you come back to church sometime when you're not high?" And I thought, well, maybe I will. So I did, and I became a Christian, and I went off to become a missionary, studying linguistics, and went off to the Amazon to a people called the Pirahãs. And their name for themselves is not Pirahãs. Hiaiche, which means the straight ones. He is straight. And we are all Awe, the bent ones. And so they're ethnocentric, like most of us are. They have constructed a hunter-gatherer culture that frowns on theoretical speculation and strain from strong empirical support. I've written a lot about the Pirahãs. And sometimes I'm misconstrued as saying that they don't do certain things because they can't, or they're not capable of it. And that's never been any claim I've ever made. If they don't do things, it's because they don't want to do it, because it's not one of their cultural values. There's nothing to do with their capabilities. You know, I don't like to steal. It doesn't mean I'm not capable of it, right? It's basically the same. So what do hunter-gatherers do? Well, they hunt and they gather. They eat what they find, so they have a better diet than most of us. They eat really good natural stuff. They eat animals, but they eat lots of plants, and it varies on the time of year. They don't work very hard because they don't need to. They work maybe 15, 20 hours a week, and the rest of the time they sit around talking and laughing and having a good time, totally irresponsible people as we think the average Pitaha man is 5'2", 155 pounds, and the average Pitaha woman is 5'1", 150 pounds. Pretty similar. Their beliefs are they don't have any. They don't have any form of religion. They don't believe in God. They don't see any need to, and they don't see any evidence for it. So that's one of the things about the Pitaha. If you've taken any philosophy, they're pretty much nominalists and empiricists. They don't believe in things that they don't have evidence for, and they don't see any real need to make generalizations beyond immediacy of experience. So there's no religion. There's also very little coercion. So you don't tell somebody what to do in the Pitaha, as a general rule. If you're a parent, you don't necessarily tell your child what to do. If you're a husband, you don't tell your wife what to do. There are no leaders, there's no hierarchical structure, there's no chief, everybody sort of exists and lives and does things as the need arises. They are the original, they're a pretty libertine society, and so I've often said they're the original if it feels good, do it society. They don't believe in hierarchical order. There are a number of interesting aspects about the Pitahas. They have no numbers, not even the number one, the only group known. So a team from MIT went down with me to the Amazon to check this out, a team from Columbia, a team from Stanford, another group from University of Miami, which happened to be my son. And they all did these experiments, and everybody. They have no words for colors, no myths, no creation myth, no story of how the world came to be or anything like that. They have the simplest kinship system known. Generation above, my generation, generation below. So anybody above me is parent. There's no distinction for male or female. So there's no word for mother in Pitaha. There's no word for father. There's just a word for parent that's fairly generic. There is my generation, which is more or less equivalent to sibling, but again, no difference between male and female. For the generation below, it's child. The only time you get a distinction for male and female is biological son and daughter, and that's that. And that's the kinship system. They prefer not to talk about the distant past or the distant future. As I published on this, some people have mistakenly thought that I meant they can't talk about the past or the future, and they don't have any concept of the past or the future. That's wrong. Everybody knows they woke up today, and it's not yesterday, and it's not tomorrow. They just don't have words for yesterday or tomorrow. They have words for today and other day. There's no word for last year or the next year. There's just this water, another water. Water cycle is a rainy season, which corresponds roughly to a year. Death is part of life. There's no story about what happens to you when you die any more than there's a story about what happens to an apple when it's gone. It's just things live and they die. Nobody's afraid of death. They're not looking for death, but nobody's afraid of death. I've never seen a Pitaha afraid of death, even though they're careful. They're not reckless. But I've seen many who are about to die, and we're all going to die. As my son used to say, if you're lucky, you live a long life, get sick, and die. That's the lucky way out. They're not superstitious. They don't believe in evil spirits or any kind of spirits. They're not afraid of the dark. They are afraid of jaguars, but not of evil spirits. However, it's really interesting. There's no hard line between fact and fiction. So they see things in the jungle that I might consider fiction, like shadowy things, because you see a lot of shadowy figures in the jungle because the light's weird. And so they give those names as other kinds of entities. But it's not like they think they have any special powers. They're just different kinds of entities that sort of look like us. There are a lot of things you shouldn't do in Pitaha, but the worst thing you can do is to lose your temper, which would involve physical or verbal abuse. I have a loud voice. I used to be a preacher, and I used to and I still am a professor, so when I get enamored with a particular subject, I talk in a really loud voice. So many times the Pinaha would come to me and say, "Hey Dan, are you angry?" "No." "You sound angry." I said, "Well, I'm just talking, you know. But talk softer because people think you're angry and we don't like that." Pinaha were friends. I spent a lot of time trying to tell them about God. They're here. And they weren't particularly convinced. They said, "So Dan, Jesus, is he brown like us or is he white like you?" And I said, "Well, you know, some people say he was brown and other people say he was white." And they said, "But you saw him. What did he look like?" I said, "Well, I didn't actually see him." "Well, your father saw him." "No, my dad didn't see him either." "Who do you know that saw him?" I said, "Well, I don't know. Nobody saw him that I know of. I don't know anybody who saw him. So why would you tell us about it?" It didn't make any sense to them to tell them about somebody as though I was certain that they had lived and existed and I knew what they were talking about when I had no direct evidence of their existence. The Pinaha are great people. They have a fascinating language that has been quite controversial. They have a number of other characteristics that's really interesting. They have led to one of the greatest controversies of the last several decades in linguistics. But basically, they're just hunter-gatherers that live very simply. They don't build elaborate structures of any kind. In the summer months, which would be in, well, it's not summer for them technically, it's the dry season. From about the end of April until the beginning of November, they just sleep on the sand on the beaches along their river, the Missionary. And then in the rainy season, they just build very simple shelters. They have a different relationship with nature than we do. Here's a woman nursing a peccary. Because you know, they do tend to nurse animals when they find little babies because they've killed their mother or father, usually their mother. But this leads to a very different relationship with nature for their children and for themselves. They've all been raised like this. This is one of the beaches that kind of thing they live on in the summer. So it's pretty pristine and a beautiful environment. And when I went there as a missionary, I thought they were going to be really excited to hear the message of Jesus and salvation. But turns out they lived pretty well, and they weren't missing anything. That river is full of fish. It takes a man or a woman. There are some differences in social difference between male and females in the sense that women fish with hook and line and hunt with dogs. Men fish with hook and line or with bow and arrow and hunt usually with bow and arrow. But women can, you know, so nobody takes long to get great fish out of this river. It's full of fish. 70% of their diet is fish, but lots of other things. It's a typical winter home. This is one of the more elaborate structures that they have. Takes a man a few hours to build this house. I've seen them blow over in the rainy season, and the reaction at night, if the house blows over at 3 in the morning and it's pouring rain, everybody starts laughing. It's the funniest thing they ever saw. They're not worried about it. They don't get perturbed really easily, at least not among things that occur among themselves. Another beach. There's a documentary about my life and work with the Pinaha that's released in the U.S. by the Smithsonian Channel. It's called The Grammar of Happiness, and it talks about my turn to atheism. Let's give you a little example of the language, just so you can hear some of it. So that just said, only speak to me with a straight head, don't speak to me with a crooked head. The Pitahan only want a straight head. Straight head is their language, and crooked head is any other language. One of their canoes, very interesting thing is that they use these canoes all the time, but they don't actually make them. All these canoes are stolen. A little cultural fact. Some more pictures of their life. They have various forms of speech, and one of them is hum speech. Oops. This one's hard to play. No, I'll forget that. So they can hum anything they can say with consonants and vowels. They can whistle anything they can say with consonants and vowels. It's unrestricted. They can whistle about anything they can talk about, because that's just a form of talk. They have other forms of speech as well. This one is interesting. It's one of those jungle entities I talked to you about. It's a sort of Pitaha version of drama. It's not really religious, and I used to think it meant evil spirits or something like that, but it really doesn't mean anything. Like, there's no supernatural significance to this. Takes a while. Can you hear that? So that's just a guy who claims to be a different kind of entity. But if I go out to the jungle where he's making this noise, he's talking like this, and talk to him, he just switches back to his natural voice immediately. I said, "Can I record you?" "Yeah, sure, you can record me." So it's not a supernatural kind of thing. So I'm going to skip some of this stuff. Let's talk about this for a bit. When we're born born as outsiders into every culture we come into. Babies are not insiders. They've learned a little bit in their mother's womb, but they start really learning when they're born. And they go from what is anthropologists and some linguists would call the etic perspective, the outsider perspective, to the emic perspective, to the insider perspective, whether that's language or cognition or values, just any number of emotions. When I was not a Christian, I had the etic perspective of belief. I really didn't know anything about belief. I had gone to church when I was young. My mother died when I was 11, and that had a tremendous impact on my life, and she was 29, and it made me start going to church where they told me they had all the answers, and so I went. And when you're 11 and adults tell you they have the answers, that's what you want to believe, especially if it has to do with death. One of the hardest things about death for people in Western cultures and cultures that have powerful religions is the idea that that's all there is. It's really hard to believe that the person you love so much is gone. That's it. There's nothing left. They're not watching you from heaven. They're not around. They're just gone. When you're 11, that's kind of a hard thing to take if lots of otherwise responsible people tell you they're not gone. They're in heaven or they're in hell or whatever. So most of us, we not only start on the outside of our own cultures, we start on the outside of religious culture. And we're eventually convinced and brought to have an inner perspective, so that, you know, whatever religion you are, you learn to talk. If you're associated with people of faith, you learn to talk like they talk and to think like they think, and to always, God had a purpose for this. If God wills, this will happen. And that just becomes so natural and socially reinforcing that it is really difficult to believe that you could all be wrong. Actually, it's the opposite of what I felt before I was a Christian. I remember back in the 60s, before I became a Christian, and I knew enough of the Christian message to know that I was going to go to hell, and everybody who wasn't going to church was going to go to hell. And I would look at people. I'd come up to a stoplight in some city and look around at people and say, "So they're all going to hell." I can't believe that. That's really hard for me to believe that they're all going to hell. But and then when I became a Christian, I didn't have a hard time believing that. Of course they're going to hell, whatever hell is. I mean, they should have accepted Jesus. So if they don't accept Jesus, they're going to go to hell. So that leads to all sorts of absurd conclusions. So if you really push this, every fundamentalist Christian believes that every Jew who died in the Holocaust is going to go in hell. They went to hell. Anybody who dies outside of Jesus is going to go to hell. And so what happened was, when I talked to people, first I noticed that they didn't really seem to have any need for the God and the gospel that I was trying to preach to them. That in itself is not terribly surprising. A lot of people are ignorant of what they need. A lot of people don't know that they need to take penicillin, but that doesn't mean penicillin is not valid. They weren't afraid of anything or death. They were also very happy. They seemed to be extremely content and happy, and in fact more so than most of the missionaries I knew. In fact, than all the missionaries, more than me. Every time I would, first time I went to Brazil as a missionary, 1977. I came back to the U.S. for a 6-week visit in 1982, so 5 years, right, without ever hearing, rarely hearing English. My children didn't know that anybody outside of our family spoke English. My son, who was 9 months old when we went to Brazil, thought English was a secret code we spoke in the family. So came back, and the church would say, "How many converts do you have?" And I said, "Well, none yet. No, nobody believes. What? You must not be a very good." So they would have me preach, and they said, "Well, you're actually a good preacher, so we don't understand why they're not believing. Don't you speak the language?" I said, "Yeah, actually, I speak the language pretty well. They just aren't going to. They're just not believing. There's not striking a chord with them." So I showed slides of the Pitaha, and one woman came up to me afterwards. If you're a missionary, you're supported, your financial support, there are two kinds of missionary organizations, what are called faith organizations and salary organizations. So if you're a missionary for the Baptists, the Baptist denomination, they just pay you a salary. It's actually a pretty good salary wherever you're at. So most of the Baptist missionaries I knew, and all the denominational missionaries I knew, had maids and nice cars and big fancy homes and stuff, and they lived in the cities. But those of us who belong to faith missions, that means you only get money if people give it to you, individuals. You don't get money from denominations. So we had about 200 or 300 people who gave us money from $5 a month to $100 a month, and that's how we got all our income. If they didn't give money, we didn't have any income. So one woman who gave me like $10 a month came up and said, "I saw pictures of naked children in your slides." I said, "Yeah, they don't wear clothes. It's really hot in the jungle and they don't make clothes." She said, "Well, why am I supporting you if after you've been there all these years you haven't taught them that it's a sin not to wear clothes?" And even as a fundamentalist missionary, it never occurred to me that it was a sin for them not to wear clothes. So I began to realize that what missionaries are supposed to do is get people to conform to the American way of life, or whatever country you come from, American, English, English, French, whatever. So you meet missionaries from the Netherlands. You know, I met missionaries from all over. The German missionaries had it the best because the German government pays them a certain amount for every child they have. Any German citizen is paid extra for children. So you find missionaries with 7 or 8 kids. They make quite a good living in Brazil, getting money from the German government, so they're missionaries. Then I was also, at the same time, I was doing my PhD at the Universidade Estadual de Campinas in Brazil. And I had a lot of Brazilian professors that I really admired, and Brazilian students, Brazilian colleagues. They found it anomalous that somebody who was trying to be a serious thinker about something was a fervent fundamentalist believer about Christianity. And I was pretty good at defending my position. You know, most of us in academics are good at defending any position we take, which is why long after we've stopped believing in our PhD stuff, we're defending it to everybody. That's just the nature of academics. Take any side of any debate. If you say something that you didn't really think that much about and you didn't really have a strong opinion about it, if somebody criticizes you, now you have a strong opinion about it, and you're going to defend it. So I defended Christianity a lot, but at the same time that I defended it, I began to think that you know, maybe this isn't what I thought. So I became a believer in 1968. I was 17. I met my wife. I was standing in front of a Jimi Hendrix concert with a bag full of LSD, selling it to get the money to get in to see Jimmy. And but it was only $2 to see Jimi Hendrix. The most expensive concert I ever went to was the Beatles, which was $5. She came up with her boyfriend, and I asked them for money, and she said, "Give him $1 so he'll leave us alone." So he gave me $1. It only cost $2 to get in. I was in. And then I realized she went to my high school, so I went to see her, and you know, she wasn't too sure about that this guy who was selling LSD. But she talked to me a lot about Christianity, and then I went to her home, and her parents were missionaries in Brazil. And they had just come back from, and they had been missionaries for, this was 68, so they were missionaries originally in 56, so they'd been missionaries for 12 years. And her father, who's now gone, was the most interesting man I ever met, still by far the most interesting man I ever met. He flew across Brazil in an ultralight plane. He paddled hundreds of miles out into the, I mean, I've gone thousands of miles by myself in the middle of the Amazon, down rivers, but by motorboat. He paddled all those places. He believed that everyone was worthy of respect. He loved the Indians. If anything, he thought they were superior to any, you know, to Americans and stuff. I mean, he really, it's another form of racism, but it's just not as bad, perhaps, as the racism that says Americans are better. But we would stay up, he and I, until 3 or 4 in the morning, very often on Fridays and Saturdays when I would go spend the night at their place. And he would talk to me about Jesus, about faith, about what he did to become a missionary, about how rewarding it is to give medicine that saves people's lives and to see people. He told me the story of the chief of the Satere Mawe, very famous group in the Amazon, where they translated the New Testament. And he translated the story of the resurrection of Jesus. And the chief said, "Well, you don't mean he was dead. You meant that he was asleep and then he woke up." He said, "No, he was dead and then he arose." And the chief said, "If he did that, then I believe in him." And that's how religion entered the Satere, and he was very proud of that. It took me a long time to realize that's you know, bullshit. That Jesus didn't rise from the dead, and it's really a shame that you're telling people this crap. But I told people that stuff. So I remember the first time I showed a video of there's a film made by Campus Crusade for Christ, the Jesus film, which has actors portraying Jesus. And so you show this. Well, the Piraha, as I said, they don't have a strong distinction between fact and fiction. So they saw Jesus. I said this was Jesus, so they saw Jesus, and they said, very interesting. So the next day they came back, one guy came back and he said, yeah, we don't want to hear about Jesus anymore. I said, why is that? He said, well, last night there was a guy calling himself Jesus who came into the village and he had a 3-foot-long penis and he was trying to assault all the women, and so we don't want him around anymore. And I said, where the hell did that story come from? But that's the kind of interesting idea they come up with to explain their lack of interest in this story that you're telling. It was a pretty effective way. If Jesus is a rapist, they don't want to hear any more about him. That sort of killed the story there. But I eventually realized that they were right and I was wrong. And I was the superstitious one coming from Western culture with my education from Moody Bible Institute. I graduated #1 in Bible and Theology, #1 in my class from Moody Bible Institute in 1975, the #1 training school for missionaries. And I knew the Bible. I still know the Bible really well. I mean, that's the funny thing when I talk to Christians. They start to tell me all these verses, and I said, look, I know all the verses better than you do. I mean, I just really, there's no new information you have to give me on this. That doesn't mean that I'm right and they're wrong. It just means that there's no new information they have to give me. I'm not going to be convinced by these things. So, but when you're a missionary and your whole income comes from believing, right? I mean, your whole income comes from this. So then you start to realize, I'm not so sure I believe this, but I told my kids to believe this, and they all believe it. And my wife's always believed this stuff. And my supporters, the people who give me money, if I tell them I don't believe, I'm unemployed. So this was about 1982, and I would say things, but it took me a long time, 2001, so just 20 years, 19 years, before I finally said, what really led me to take the stand and say, I'm going to, whatever the hell it takes, I'm not going to pretend that I believe this stuff anymore, was the Iraq War. Not that you all would share my politics, but people started to write me, Christians, about how wonderful it was that we were going in there to give the Iraqis the message of Jesus, and how the soldiers, the American soldiers, were the angels of mercy and the angels of peace. And I thought, yeah, screw this. I'm not going to pretend to believe. I'm not going to pretend anymore. So I just told everybody, yeah, I don't believe this stuff. But I was unemployed. But I also had a job at the University of Pittsburgh, and then I went to the University of Manchester. So I started at the University of Pittsburgh as my first academic job was the University of Campinas, and I went there in 1978 as a graduate student. And from 1981, I finished my PhD in 1983, the first PhD in linguistics in Brazil, as far as I can tell. And then, so I was there from 81 to 86 as a faculty member. Then I went to the University of Pittsburgh in 88, and I was there until 99. I didn't believe anything, but I thought that I should. So this is a long struggle. So I went back, I quit my tenured full professorship, chairman of the department, and moved back to Brazil as a missionary in 99, and then realized I don't believe this stuff. I tried to save my marriage, but it didn't work. And the University of Manchester in England offered me a full professorship, so I took it and announced to my family that I was not a believer. So that led to a divorce. I married my wife, the girl that I met in front of the Jimi Hendrix concert. We got married at 18. We started a family at 19, and we were married for 35 years. So that was not a light thing. I think we're both happier now, but it was a big thing. And so my kids didn't talk to me for 2 years. My grown children wouldn't talk to me. I just had no contact with them at all. That was hard. My son was still a believer then. He was in a PhD program. Actually, when he finished his degree at the University of Pittsburgh, he was a dual major in math and psychology, and he took a job with Morgan Stanley as a stockbroker and commodities dealer. But he was still a believer. And if you're thinking about telling your family and others that you don't believe when they all expect you to believe, if that's the kind of background you come from, well, you know it's not going to be easy. It's going to be really hard. People aren't going to understand what you're talking about. You've betrayed them in a way. I think the biggest lesson for my kids, so after 2 years they started talking to me. Then I got remarried. I actually didn't, after 35 years of marriage, I thought marriage was an extremely sad institution that only brought misery. But actually it turns out to be a pretty nice thing sometimes. Not that you have to get married, but I'm old enough that marriage seems like a natural thing to do. Yeah, I met my new father-in-law, and he said, "You don't believe any of that? You don't still believe any of that religious shit, do you?" And I said, "No." He said, "Good, because we weren't going to get along." So I knew right then I was in a new family. I was in a different environment, and it felt very liberating. But it was the hardest thing that ever happened to me to have to tell people that after all these years, I didn't believe. And I always did believe. You know, so nowadays, the common story, if you look up Moody Bible Institute on Wikipedia, and you look at notable alumni, I'm listed as an atheist. I'm a total demerit on the institution. You know, for a lot of people, the only explanation is that I never really believed. Because there are a lot of faiths that believe. And, you know, when I was at the University of Manchester, I used to go into all the Muslim bookstores. You know, huge Muslim population in Manchester, and I wanted to see what the Muslims are reading, you know. And it's basically the Arabic versions of all the things the Christians are reading. There's so many similarities between Islam and Christianity that it's really hard to fathom how similar they are. So just as any Christian bookstore would have a section on why evolution is not true, the Muslim bookstores had sections on why evolution is not true and why only design can explain the world. So, you know, the theologies are so similar of those two religions, you know. And you know, in 2012, the University of Tel Aviv had a special event on my new book, and there was a big conference that brought people from all over Israel. And I remember I was in the home of a good friend, a philosopher at Tel Aviv, celebrating the Passover, and not the Passover actually, just Shabbat. And they were doing all this stuff, and he stopped in the middle. He said, "We don't believe any of this shit. You know?" He said, "This is just custom, and we do this because you know, we celebrate our heritage. We don't believe this crap." Just to get that straight, you know. So, but it is interesting to see the similarities in religions. In a book that I wrote in 2016, my penultimate book, Dark Matter of the Mind, the Culturally Articulated Unconscious, I was surprised to come to the conclusion that the self and human nature are, in my view of culture, much more similar to the Buddhist view than any other view. But partially because Buddhists are like Unitarian Christians. They don't believe in fundamentalist religious concepts. So I accepted Jesus. I believe the Bible, as I used to say, I believe the Bible from cover to cover and even the covers. I believe it is the inspired, plenary, verbal, inspired Word of God. And I preached on it regularly. You know, we just, Easter's already happened this year, right? But for many years, I preached at sunrise services every Easter. And I got a lot of people to convert and come to Jesus during those times. And many of them wrote me after they found out that I was no longer a Christian. A guy says, "I'm only a Christian because of you. You told me this was the way to believe, and now you left the faith." And one guy said, "You're the greatest Bible teacher I ever had, and now you're not a Christian anymore." I said, "Yeah, well." I said, "I believed it when I was teaching it, but I just don't believe it now." So it was really hard for people. And they, you know, I had, of those 200 or so supporters who gave us money every month, not one of them talks to me. They all give money to my ex-wife. Good for her. Good for them. Keeps her in the Amazon. But she's actually the toughest person I've ever known. She's a really interesting person, and I don't. You know, we just weren't made to live together. But she's, except for 35 years, you know. Now, if somebody says, "Oh, we just celebrated our 30th anniversary," I tell them, "I hope it works out. You know, hope it lasts." But those people don't speak to us because to them I'm a traitor. So the Pitaha, I went to them to be a missionary, to convert them. They converted me, mainly them, more than anything else. After a certain amount of time, my son reached the same conclusion. You know, he said, I don't believe it. So the other day, my 9-year-old grandson, my son's son, his other grandparents took him to a Catholic church, and I said, "What'd you think?" And he said, "It sounded like one old man lying to a bunch of other old people who are afraid to die." Well, that's pretty good. I mean, I think that's pretty much what happens. And he's around his cousins who are all believers, and they're talking about Jesus. And he said, "Do you also pray to Santa Claus?" "I don't understand what you believe, you know." One of my good friends is a philosopher, John Searle, University of California, Berkeley, and I remember somebody asked him once, "Are you?" If anybody hears a philosopher, you will know that John Searle has been struck by unforgivable scandal from the Me Too movement, assaulting a graduate student. But I knew him before that, so I don't condone that. But I'm just telling a story that happened before that. So somebody said, an 84-year-old man assaulting a graduate. That's very bizarre. But anyway, so somebody said, "What does it mean to you not to be a Christian, not to be a believer of any kind?" And he said, "I don't know. What's it like to you not to believe in Santa Claus?" I don't know. Why can't he? They said, "Do you call yourself an atheist?" He said, "I don't like those terms. I don't have any special term for not believing in Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy. Why is there a special term needed for not believing in God?" So when we talk about atheism versus agnosticism, you know, some people think agnosticism is the humble route, right? Because you're just saying there's not enough evidence for me to know. But I think that's kind of silly. You know, it's not that there's not enough evidence, there's no effing evidence for God. So I'm an atheist. Well, what does that mean? It means that I don't believe in God. Does it mean I have anything in common with other atheists? Not necessarily. I mean, if having a negative is something in common, there's lots of things we don't do and don't believe in. It doesn't mean that atheists share any common set of values. I actually think that atheists in particular cultures have a certain moral courage and a certain free-thinking ability, which is where the idea of free thinker comes from. And so I tremendously expect that, but you can't label somebody an atheist and think that they share all these values in common with other atheists, you know. I'm an atheist, and there are times I try to be a vegan and other times when I eat steak, and I'm very inconsistent in some of my other views, you know. There's not a single moral argument in favor of eating meat I can support, and yet I occasionally eat meat. But has nothing to do with whether I'm an atheist or not. It's just I'm a person, and there's lots of things going on in life. So atheists are people who said there's no evidence for God, and life is more happily lived without him. I will tell you right now, when you see an entire group of people that is basically illustrates John Lennon's song Imagine, the Pitaha, and how happy they are, and how fearless they are, and how respectful of one another they are. You know, they're not totally consistent. When I say the Pitaha are this or that, I could also say that Americans are not thieves, and Americans don't kill people. You know, American culture is not defined by killing people, but a lot of Americans kill people, and a lot of Americans steal. So there are always exceptions. It doesn't mean that that describes the whole culture. So yeah, there are some Pitaha who are not as nice as other Pitaha, but by and large, the culture is astounding, and they have a lot to teach us. This has led me to a principle that I call wisdom from strangers, and I have a TEDx talk on exactly this title, if you look it up, Wisdom from Strangers. So the idea is that people who are more like us have less new information to share with us, because most things they know we also know. And they talk like us, and they eat like us, and they look like us. And that means that we're going to learn less from them. We're always going to learn more. Well, always is a big word. But we're usually going to learn more from people who look less like us, who think less like us, who eat differently from us. So by and large, women and men are going to learn more from each other than men are going to learn from other men. And white men are going to learn more from black men than they're going to learn from other white men, sort of idea. People always get upset because there are all these tech industries that are just all white men. And so they say, well, there's all this stuff being learned. Yeah, but I'm not talking about technology. I'm talking about values and morality, how to live a good life, but also about technology stuff. I really think that if you're sitting around a boardroom, I mean, I'm dean at a business school, and I tell people this all the time. If you look around a boardroom and everybody is middle-aged white man, which is almost always going to be the case, you're not going to get a lot of new ideas from that group. Everybody's going to reinforce everybody else's ideas by and large. If you want to get a lot of new ideas, you've got to have a group where nobody looks alike. But wisdom from strangers. So the first principle of that I talk about is submissive learning. You can't learn from other people unless you submit yourself to their rules and their values and their way of life. So I was dean on a program called Semester at Sea. It's a ship that takes students around the world. And you get off in all these different countries, and people think they've seen the world, and therefore they know something about the world. And I said, you know, you really don't know anything about the world unless you've lived there long enough to learn their language, like their food, and live by their regulations. So if you go to India, for example, and I remember we were pulling into Madras, this ship with 600 students, and the doctor was saying, don't eat anything off the street. It'll give you diarrhea. Don't eat this stuff off the street. And then I stood up and I said, listen to the doctor. I'm not going to contradict his advice, but I'm only going to eat off this food on the street, because that's where the best food is. If you see all the Indians eating that food, you know you can eat it. Other people, we're biologically the same. I mean, they have more bacterial, more resistance to some stuff, but as just as we do. So submissive learning, living with the people, is the only way you're going to really, and according to their values, you're going to learn. Learning confidence, tolerance, and learning to wait for evidence. Every group has its own standards of evidence. Those tend to overlap empirically. I'm not saying there's no truth, but there are various interpretations of the world and things that happen in the world. And learning about those various interpretations can be quite mind-bending and mind-altering. I used to think in the 60s that the best way to alter your mind and open your mind was to take drugs, but actually I think now it's cross-cultural experiences with other people and learning from other people. And cross-cultural doesn't mean cross-national or going to other countries. That's a great way to do it, but I've advocated living a week with strangers, finding a family that was willing to take you in for a week or two and just living with them. They're unlike you, and live how they live and try to adapt to that. Run your well deep and irrigate widely. If you're a scientist or any kind of person, but think about being a scientist. The most effective scientists with the greatest, say, public impact are people who know their specialty extremely well. They have dominated it, and they're a world leader in their specialty, but they're now able to think about how to apply that to lots of other areas. That doesn't mean that if you're an intellectual in one area, you have the right to have an opinion about everything. As I've often said, not everybody does have the right to an opinion. You have the right to say whatever you think, but if you have an opinion about the cultural impact of financial derivatives, and you've never studied finance, sort of keep it to yourself kind of thing. But run your well deep and irrigate widely. Develop personal confidence by understanding yourself and others. The Pitaha were very good to me. They took me in. They tolerated all my attempts to tell them they were doing everything wrong. And then they told me that I was doing things wrong. Well, they didn't say it like that. They just asked questions. Socratic method, where they asked questions that I couldn't answer, and And they convinced me that my answers that I thought I had weren't the right answers. So, in a sense, I've come full circle. I started off as an atheist, and now I'm an atheist again. I had a great period of time where I was a believer. I'm not saying those years were all bad. I wished I would have met my current wife a lot earlier, and I wouldn't have had a lot of the experiences that I had in religion, but I'm glad for all the experiences I had in the Amazon and all the lessons I learned. But I still lost all those couple of hundred friends from churches, thousands of people actually that I spoke to. I mean, I spoke to a lot of churches. I spoke to crowds of tens of thousands. You know, I remember I was speaking at giving a TED talk in San Francisco, and there were like 2,000 people there, and somebody said, "Are you nervous?" I said, "I was a Christian evangelist." I said, "This is a small crowd." I mean, I want to get my message right. I'm not arrogant about it. I don't want to make a fool of myself, but you know, I speak to lots of big groups of people as a Christian, none of whom talk to me anymore. None of whom really want much to do with me. It is interesting. I spoke at a Christian missionary conference in 1990 where there were 23,000 people there. I remember all these groupies coming up afterward asking for my autograph and telling me how they could hear the voice of God coming from me and how they knew Jesus was speaking through me, and I'm thinking, yeah, I don't think he is actually. I mean, I just remember thinking about what I was going to say this morning, and that's exactly what I said. So I don't see where he could have, but it is really hard. Our societies, as absolutely strange as it seems in the 21st century, still have all these strong beliefs about God, where politicians believe they need to talk about God as a condition for running for office. I remember that I applied for a provost job in North Carolina. And then I read that it's actually still, today, illegal to be an atheist in North Carolina. They don't enforce this law, but it is illegal. And it is also illegal to hire an atheist by any state organization. And I remember the guy interviewing me for the job. Now, I saw a video of yours where you was saying you don't believe anymore. I said, yeah, I don't believe that stuff. I never met a non-believer before in my whole life. I never met anybody like you. And I knew I wasn't going to be the provost, but it was also very interesting meeting. And this was not a Christian university. This was Appalachian State University, North Carolina. It's a university, right? But the cultural divides are very strong, and what it takes to be an atheist is very different. My grandchildren who believe come to me, and they're so smart and so great. I have one granddaughter, Madison, who is a straight A student. She could go to any university she wanted to go to. She's a track star, a swim star, and she thinks evolution is a lie invented by Satan. And she says, "Aren't you afraid of going to hell? I feel so bad. I'm worried about you going to hell." I said, "Why would you worry about whether I'm going to hell?" "Well, you're my grandpa, and I don't want you to burn in hell." I said, "But remember, it's my job, right? It's my responsibility. I've weighed the evidence, and I don't think there is a hell. And if I turn out to be wrong, that's not your fault. That's mine. So don't worry about it. You shouldn't worry about that stuff." But there are a lot of people who write me. I get letters every day from people who read my book, Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes, in which there's only one chapter that says I'm not a believer. The rest of the time is about the Pitahan language and stuff, but only in the last chapter, chapter 14, do I talk about the end of my missionary life and the end of my faith and the breakup of my family. And I still get letters from all over, people telling me I'm going to hell, and they say, "Don't you feel arrogant that you're telling people there's no Jesus?" And I said, "Well, so that's arrogant, but you telling me I'm going to burn for eternity, that's not arrogant." That's really interesting perspective there. So Jesus talked a lot about love. One of the most amazing things, and I'll stop with this, that from church, my church experience, is that every minister I ever knew tried to explain why the words of Moses were literal. The world was created in 6 days. But the words of Jesus were not literal. Turn the other cheek. It's easier for a rich man to go through the eye of a needle. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to get into heaven. This stuff is all figurative. One guy said, Jesus never said that we should give all our money to the poor. He said we should be willing to do that. I said, that's very interesting. So if there are poor people and you have the money and you're willing to do it, why don't you give it to them? Doesn't sound like you're willing, right? So whatever, you lost. I know it's hard. I also want to say that it's extremely liberating. I have friends who've told me, gay friends who've told me about their experiences of coming out of the closet. And so when you talked about coming out, I mean, I'm not gay, so I don't know what that would be like, but I do know that when I told people I wasn't a Christian, I lost a lot of friends. I lost my family for a while. But also, for the very first time in my adult life, I felt honest, and I felt free, and I didn't feel like I had to make up stories and tell people, make excuses. And I just said, I don't believe that stuff. I just don't believe it. I teach a class at Bentley, a business university, but I teach a class on human evolution. And it's amazing how many people are Christians at the university. And evolution is still a controversial subject in some parts of this country, including Waltham, Massachusetts, which I find to be very strange. But I also find it very liberating not to worry about what people think or to feel like I'm doing anything morally wrong when I talk about the non-existence of God. So I'll stop there and see if there are questions or anything.
Thank you for your talk. So you said the canoe is stolen from somewhere? They don't have tools.
No, they don't make tools to make these kinds of... But I did teach them how to make those kinds of canoes. So I brought in a Brazilian canoe master. I bought them all the tools that were needed, and he taught them how to make a canoe, and they made a beautiful canoe. So then they came to me and they said, we want another one of those canoes. I said, well, make one. Pirahãs don't make canoes. We don't make those things. So that was the end of it. They made one. And that's just not... working really hard for something, it just doesn't make a lot of sense for them, except for hunting. Yeah.
You said you started to disbelieve Christian because those people asked you some questions that you cannot answer?
Yeah.
What are those questions?
Well, just questions about evidence. So, I would tell people about Jesus, and one of the interesting things that challenged my faith was that they liked me so much and respected me so much, they would believe things if I told them, assuming that I had direct evidence. So if I told them about Jesus, initially they believed exactly what I told them. Because,
they mean those people.
Yeah, the Pirahãs. And then I realized that I felt guilty about that, because I didn't expect them to just grab onto it so fast and then they started asking me. So there were a couple of things. First of all, the questions they asked me about the evidence that I had. That was all it was. Who saw Jesus? Who did this? What's the empirical basis for what you're saying? That was the number one thing. But also the fact that Christianity claims that it will change your life and transform you and give you a better life. That's some denominations of Christianity make that claim. And yet, all the Christians I knew, and I was a Christian for a long time, and a minister and all this stuff, none of them really had that kind of quality of life that the average Pirahã had, who didn't believe. So it wasn't that I found this, totally overwhelming logically or anything like that, but it just caused me to think. I think very few of us change our minds because we lost an argument. We often change our minds because some experience causes us to think in solitude about our own beliefs and reach a different conclusion. So these experiences caused me, in my own solitude, to rethink the things that I had thought. So the greatest persuader in my life against Christianity was me, as I began to think through these things and see my faith because I worked very hard to become a missionary. It took a lot of training, a lot of education. Believe it or not, it takes a lot of education to be a missionary. You know, I can read I translate the New Testament directly from Greek into Pitahan. You know, I mean, linguistically, there's a lot of training. And I was totally convinced, but these things led me to doubt, and then eventually to say that I used to preach that what is the evidence for God? The evidence for God cannot be, for the Christian God, cannot be just what the Bible says. There has to be empirical evidence. There's a book Christians like in the area of apologetics, defense of the faith, called Evidence That Demands a Verdict, from a guy named Josh McDowell. It was really popular back in the 60s and 70s. And that book was very convincing for a lot of Christians because it went through all the evidence for God. It's actually totally bogus, and you know, anybody who's got half a decent education can take it apart pretty quickly. But what is the evidence for your faith? That idea is important. And I used to say that the only evidence that is convincing is what God has done in your life. How are you different? Since you claim to have the Holy Spirit and power, how are you different from anybody who doesn't have faith? How is your life qualitatively better than theirs? And the answer is, it isn't. It just isn't. And I went through all the thoughts of, you know, I thought about this for a long period of time in my own life and other people's life. And so if you just compare people according to the standards of contentment, morality, all of these things that the Christian faith holds very important, or take the evidence of prayer, and what does prayer do in people's life? There's no evidence for any of this.
There are two kinds of Christian. One believe in miracle.
Yeah.
The other are Catholic. They don't believe in miracle. Which kind are you?
Well, I was a fundamentalist Protestant miracle-believing Christian, although I didn't believe I ever saw a miracle. And I knew Christians who did. I just thought that miracles. There are two kinds of people in miracles in the fundamentalist part of Christianity. Those who believe that miracles are ongoing, and those who believe that miracles were a sign for the first century to convince people that Jesus had been real and that it stopped after that. And I was of that kind. So that's convenient because I can believe the miracles of the Bible, but I don't have to actually think they happen today. Yeah, there are a lot of different kinds of Christians, but there's a lot of different kinds of faiths. But the basic fundamental point in the religions where it makes sense to come out of is the idea that there's a supreme being that controls your life, and there's a morality and a way of thinking that's dictated by an ancient book that tells you how you ought to live, as opposed to your own rationality, your own experiences, and your own sense of judgment. That was what the Pitahan taught me. I mean, everybody's affected by culture. We're all affected in ways that we don't realize by our culture. You know, that's the purpose of my book, Dark Matter of the Mind. Implicit bias that people talk about. I mean, that's part of that. You know, all the things we do that we don't know. Some of the most important things we know, we don't know we know. And so culture is there, but religion works its way into that. It's sort of like, I'm sure you've all thought of it this way too. It's a mental virus, and it takes a while to realize all the places it's infected your brain. Yeah. Yes?
So you said, I think, that the main appeal for you leaving Christianity was the rational part, more reason. I was wondering what the appeal was for you going into Christianity initially.
Yeah, I would say that it was rational, but it was also political and emotional. I got tired of, so it was those. But what got me to go into Christianity was rational and emotional. I came from a very low-class economically family. I was the first person in my family to ever go to college. I was one of the very first to ever graduate from high school. I grew up I spent most of my early life in a trailer park, in a trailer with no bathroom or anything like that. So my father was an alcoholic. So the first Christian family I met, they were not alcoholics, and they had a nice home, and they were nice people, and they treated you with respect, and that was extremely appealing to me. Also, they thought they had college degrees. Nobody in my family had college degrees. These Christians I met had college degrees, and they read the Bible and they had intelligent discussions about the Bible, you know. I mean, in retrospect, I could think that they're not founded on much empirically, but they were interesting, intelligent discussions. So that was all extremely appealing. The fact that I, at 17 years old, with, as far as anybody knew, I was, you know, fairly stupid. I mean, I was a terrible student. I flunked all my classes my junior year, sold books. And I sold all my school books at a swap meet so I could buy drugs, and flunked all my classes. I'm amazed. When I taught in England, I used to like to, when I taught at the University of Manchester, I like to tell the students I could never get into this school, but I can be a professor here. Just could never go here. You know, I would have never been admitted to MIT as an undergraduate, but my first PhD student's a professor here, and so it's sort of interesting. But it was rational, and it was emotional, and the same things led me out of it. I believed that when things worked together, God was doing those things. And when things didn't work together, I was screwing up. Really interesting. It's a non-falsifiable belief system. There's no way to prove to anybody that Christianity is wrong. Just like there's no way to prove that being a Republican or a Democrat is wrong. I mean, all very similar stuff. Or to prove that being a Chomsky linguist is wrong.
So first, I relate to your story. I was a Mormon missionary at one point. Not as hardcore as you were, for sure. My question is, given that the evidence of what you believe, right, or your practice in your life seems to be very important to you, what would you tell to people back then or even now that would say that that is not important, or maybe even not a valid, well, let's say that this particular person believes in Christianity regardless of that. You know, like whatever effect it has in their life, it doesn't matter. It's about what they will get in the afterlife.
Yeah. Well, there are a couple things. I was a missionary for a long time, and I'm no longer a missionary. So I'm no longer trying to convert anybody, whether they're a Christian to atheism or an atheist to Christianity. You know, if you want to believe that shit, I'm not going to get in your way. But I will ask you questions. If I have to cross paths with you a lot, I will ask you questions. I consider belief in the supernatural to be a dangerous force in modern society. I think there's nothing really neutral about it. It's a bad thing. But I also don't feel any special calling from the God of atheism to tell people that they're wrong. And so I ask questions and you know, tell them what I think. But I don't just introduce that. You know, when my believing daughters and my believing grandchildren come to my house for dinner, which is not as often as I would like, my completely atheist wife, who has never known anything about the Bible and can't understand why anybody would believe anything, always asks them to pray before our meal. And she's totally respectful about it, because it would be so rude in her standard to treat them rudely because they didn't agree with us in the way we believe. In fact, to do that would be to behave just as I used to behave. So if I know somebody well enough to have a conversation with them about things like that, I will tell them what I believe and ask them what I believe. If they're my daughters, I am not going to let that come between us, because I love them more than I love not believing. They know how I feel. You know, I mean, I tell them jokes sometimes that they don't like, "Hey, you with the beard, drop that cross one more time, you're out of the parade." But I thought that was a funny joke, actually. But they don't tend to laugh at those things. But it's Dad, and they know Dad, and so they can put up with it, and they think about it. And you know, I have really good conversations with my daughters because of it. The hardest thing it was for them is to learn that I'm still pretty much the same dad that raised them. You know, and they can come to me. And my middle daughter, who is a very strong believer, says that I'm her nurturing parent. I'm always the one that she could come to in time of need, and always count on to be there and emotionally supportive. And that means a lot to me, and it also means to her that you can't write somebody off because they don't believe. So that's as close as a discussion about faith I'm going to get with her, because I'm not going to push it. Yes.
I was curious if you went back to the Amazon since, and have you talked to the tribes that you, and like has their experience with you changed? If you
Yeah.
can talk to them.
So I had a talk with them and said, you know, I don't believe anymore. And they said, you're just like us now. You know, they thought that was the funniest thing. They were laughing. They thought that was great. And they said, but Karen still believes, right? Yeah. She's not going to stop. You know, she's always going to believe that. But they thought that was great. They thought it was wonderful. And we had wonderful conversations. And they associated Christianity with not doing things, you know, not drinking and not, you know. I mean, the Pitaha are pretty sexual people, and they're very, you know, it's not only a group, there's like 700 Pitaha, everybody knows everybody, but not only does everybody know everybody, everybody's probably had sex with everybody at one time or another in the history of the group. Most men are bisexual. I suspect women are too, but I don't know for sure. But, you know, I remember walking out with my 12-year-old daughter, and I'm a missionary. My 12-year-old daughter, who's now a mother, was watching two guys with their pants down, really going at it in our living room. And I walked out there and I said, yeah, don't do that in front of my girls. Do what? What you're doing? Oh, he doesn't want us doing this. Okay, you got any candy, Dan? I mean, it's just like, didn't mean anything to them. It was just like, that's when I realized that they have a very different view of those things, you know, and so I was with them, and they thought that was great, and that now I was more like them than ever before. So for me, it was very liberating to talk to them about that as well. Yes.
I was just struck by when you were sharing about when you were still a Christian and having some colleagues that were like, oh, that's pretty anomalous. Do you find yourself having a similar experience? Do you have relationships with colleagues of faith? What is that like?
Well, you know, I meet a lot of people in the academy who are strong Christians or strong in faith of one kind or another. And I know well enough from my own experience that to do that, you have to shut off parts of you've got your brain sort of compartmentalized. If you applied, let's say, you know, I met a guy who was a Nobel Prize winning astronomer who was a very strong believer. But I happen to believe myself that if he applied the same rigor in thinking to his faith that he applied to astronomy, he would have a different conclusion. But not for me to say. But the fact that he was a Nobel Prize winner, I mean, actually, let's face it, if you win a Nobel Prize, everybody wants to know your opinion about everything. And so he gave these talks, but he spoke, I first met him when he gave a talk to the Center for Philosophy of Science at the University of Pittsburgh, which has the #1 philosophy. It's the #1 place for philosophy in the world still. And the philosophers at Pitt were just like, what a joke. This guy's a stupid moron when it comes to religion. He may have won a Nobel Prize in astronomy, but that just shows that astronomy doesn't engage the full intellect. All of us hold inconsistent beliefs. Every one of us hold mutually inconsistent beliefs. Nobody in this room, and nobody, I don't believe anywhere in human history, has ever carefully thought through every single thing they believed and compared it with every other thing they believed for consistency. We just don't have time to do that, and it's not that important anyway, you know. So I don't get upset because some people are inconsistent. At least I try not to. Where I do get upset is if they're trying to pass laws to outlaw evolution, or they're trying to, you know, let's face it, 9/11 was an act of faith. I mean, that was a faith-based operation. And the Crusades were a faith-based operation. I just think that that religion has been a terrible, awful thing in world history. I can't think of much at all that's redeeming about it. It has done a few good things, but basically it's just killing people in the name of bullshit. But obviously not every individual believer is constructed like that. They don't want to kill anybody. And they don't believe that what they believe is bullshit. None of us believe that. Although we all believe a lot of bullshit. You know, we just, if we thought that's what it was, we wouldn't believe it. So, you know, religious people are just people like us, like atheists are just people, and agnostics are just people. And I wish that some religious people could wake up a few minutes after death and be able to tell us there was no heaven. But nobody's going to find out there was no heaven, right? Nobody's ever going to know that. Nobody's ever going to know there's no hell. Nobody's ever going to know there is a heaven either, because there isn't one, and I'm pretty sure that.
So about the pirahas, does crime ever happen in their society, or what they were considered to be crime? And if so, do they have a system for punishing it or otherwise dealing with it?
Yeah. So crime is pretty much, I mean, everybody takes, if you leave something unattended, somebody's going to take it. That's the theft to us. But to them, it's like you didn't watch it and I can use it. So it's not a big deal. Violence against somebody is a crime. That is a sin. That is a bad thing to do. So the one Pitaha guy I know who killed an outsider, I've never known another Pitaha. Pitaha get drunk and they get in fights, you know, just as my dad did all the time, which is like that. But the one Pitaha who seriously hurt somebody, who actually killed somebody from the outside, was ostracized from the village and died alone in the jungle. Nobody hurt him, nobody did anything to him, they just stopped sharing with him and made it clear he wasn't welcome with them. And so he left and he died alone. That was his punishment. You can't survive as a hunter-gatherer alone.
Do they have alcohol? Is that like a drug?
They don't make any alcohol, but they do get it a lot from the outside, from river traders. And they don't, it doesn't take much for them to get drunk, and I have seen the entire village, every man, woman, and child falling down drunk. Because they also don't believe that children shouldn't consume what adults consume. I mean, you're just all people, right? So they don't have this distinction like it's okay for adults, but it's not okay for children. What's okay for me is okay for you. I mean, I don't care. It's your business.
So these very small minority people, their civilization is far from the one you are trying to convert them.
Yeah.
They don't have a basis to to understand or comprehend what you are doing, and most importantly, don't need, because they have enough food and they have enough everything.
Yeah.
But if you want to have a much higher desire or searching, or to strive for something much higher power, to access more accessibilities like outside society, it's going to be a totally different question and the topic.
Absolutely. I mean, basically, I was trying to get them to believe legends that began 2,000 years ago in deserts that have nothing to do with the jungle, where water was rare, and they had camels and sheep and things that don't occur in the jungle, reinterpreted to 2,000 years of Western society, and now have that make sense to an Amazonian hunter-gatherer group. I began to realize fairly quickly what a huge cultural gap that was. And but there is a Christian belief shared by most missionaries, and certainly by a lot of Christians, that called Redemptive Analogies, which is that God has prepared every culture for the coming of the Savior, so that you cannot find a culture on the planet that isn't ready. If you study their legends, you will find a legend that is related to the Savior that will be the key, that will be the way in. That's very widely believed. Actually, it's not just by believers. Joseph Campbell, one of the many people I attack in Dark Matter of the Mind, believed that myths were shared across cultures. So I don't believe that. I don't believe it not in the Christian sense of belief, but I don't think there's any evidence to support that. In fact, the opposite. I don't think there's any evidence to support Freud or Jung or Chomsky or anybody who thinks that they're ideas shared by all people. If that's what you mean by psychic unity of mankind, that doesn't hold water to me. The only thing that could be psychic unity of mankind in my work is the biological similarities among humans and the cognitive and emotional similarities that are rooted in neuroscience that cause us to react in similar ways to the world. But the idea that we're all born with a single grammatical operation or a shared set of myths or something like that, it doesn't do much for me. I don't think there's much evidence for that. So it's a huge gap, and it's not an easy gap. In fact, it's an impossible. Well, I wouldn't say it's impossible. It's just it's a lot of work to get them to believe something that, after all, you know. So it's a minority.
So, do you think that possibly a lot of what you describe as the happiness and the good life that they have, I can't remember the name of the people.
Pinaha.
Pinaha. Do you think that might have a lot to do with their reluctance to consider the distant past or the distant future, so they're kind of living in the moment?
Yeah, okay, so I've made this claim, and if you read much about the Pinaha, watch the documentary, you'll see that they have very limited time words, and they don't talk about the distant past, they don't talk about the distant future. That doesn't mean they're incapable of that kind of thing. They make cultural choices not to do that and live in the present. They change names regularly. So I might talk to somebody and say, call him by his name, hey Joe, and he doesn't respond. And so I say, hey Joe, he doesn't respond. So finally he turned around and said, you talking to me? Yeah. Well, I'm not Joe. I think I used to be called Joe, but I'm not Joe. You know, I didn't do those things, and so they like totally absolve themselves from the blame. You know, I mean, that'd be great. You know, I'm not guilty of that. That was this other guy who looked like me with a different name. So they are. You know, where does a lot of our discontent come from? A lot of it comes from worrying about the future and regretting the past, and they don't do that.
So that's what I
They don't do that. So that does supply a lot of contentment. They don't worry about the future, they don't regret the past, and they sure are not worried about hell or heaven. So, so people say, well, they're a really primitive group, but that doesn't sound very primitive to me when you stop and think about it.
No.
If you want to think about what sounds primitive, look at our beliefs about religion. That sounds more primitive to me in many ways.
People are paying big bucks for self-help that's trying to tell them the same thing, just live in the moment.
And now you have a whole culture that does that.
Yeah.
You know, and that's not to say there's not abuse, but by and large, it's a culture that gives people that kind of life. There's a whole group of psychoanalysts in Münster, Germany, that had me over to talk to them because they have found the Pinaha to be a great source of ideas for therapy, and they use it a lot. And it's fantastic to me to think about that. Yes.
Did you ever, in your experience with them, see them confused or like they were trying to figure out something, and maybe it came across your mind, right? Like if only they knew about like Newtonian physics, they could figure this out, or anything about that?
Well, I mean, the jungle has a great view of the skies, right? You can see the Milky Way. So they can see, you know, satellites, artificial satellites, and they point them out and they ask me what those are, and you can see the damn. I never knew you could see satellites, but actually you can see them. And I said, well, it's like a radio up there, you know. And they said, who put it up there? And I said, I think probably Americans or Russians. I don't know who put it up there. And so that's very interesting to them. And then they say, what about the moon? Have you ever been on the moon? I said, no. But other Americans have been on the moon. Isn't it really hot? No. Looks like it ought to be hot up there. No, it's not hot. But there's all that light. I said, yeah, but it's not hot. Interesting. But, that, you know, it's not like it's totally confusing. They're happy to take that, you know. And one of them told me one time, he says, if we were born in America, we could have done all this stuff. that you did. But we weren't, and we have all these things you don't have. I asked them one time, why do you think I'm here when I was a Christian? And they said, this is a wonderful place. Makes sense, that's what it is. Thank you very much for having me. It was great to be here with you this evening.